Medieval India, Chapter number 8, The Sultan and the Nobles. The Sultan and his chief nobles enjoyed a standard of living which was comparable to the highest standard in the world at that time, viz. To be the standards of the ruling class in the Islamic world in West and Central Asia. While Europe was still trying to overcome its backwardness, the opulence and wealth of the ruling classes in the Islamic world was dazzling and set a standard which the ruling classes in every country tried to emulate. Like the Hindu rulers, almost every sultan in India built his own palace. Balban had a dazzling court in which was designed to impress and strike a sense of awe in the hearts of the visitors. Alauddin Khilji and his successors followed the same tradition. The palace of the Muhammad Tughlaq has been described by Ibn Battuta. A person who wanted to visit the Sultan had to pass through 3 lofty gates which were heavily guarded. He then entered the Court of Thousand Pillars, which was a huge hall supported by polished wooden pillars and was decorated with all kinds of costly materials and furnishings. This was the place where the Sultan held his public court. Muhammad Tughlaq used to present 2 robes of honor, one in the cold and the other in the hot season, to each of his nobles. It has been estimated that he thus presented 2 lakh robes every year. These robes generally consisted of imported cloth, velvet, damask, or wool on which brocade, velvet, and costly materials were used. They must have cost an enormous sum. Numerous gifts used to be bestowed on the nobles and others on such festive occasions as the Sultan's birthday, the Nowruz, the Persian New Year, and the annual coronation day. The royal karkhanas, which we have referred to earlier, catered to all the needs of the Sultan. They manufactured costly articles made of silk, gold, and silverware, etc. They were also stores of choice and rare goods. The superintendent of the stores was instructed by Firoz Tughlaq to buy finished articles wherever and at whatever price they were available. It is said that on one occasion, a single pair of shoes for the Sultan cost 70,000 tanaks. Most of the articles of the royal use were worked in gold and silver, embroidery, and jewels. The stores also catered to the haram. Almost every sultan had a haram containing queens and a large number of women from various countries. A large number of servants and slaves, men, women, were employed to safeguard them and to look after their comforts. All the women relations of the sultan, including his mother, aunts, etc., also lived in the haram. Separate accommodation had to be provided to each of them. The nobles tried to ape the sultans in ostentatious living. They had magnificent palaces to live in. They used costly articles of apparel and were surrounded by a large number of servants, slaves, and retainers. They vied with each other in holding lavish feasts and festivals. However, some of the nobles also patronized men of arts and letters. Alauddin sternly repressed the nobles, but the gay mood of life revived under his successors. The nobility came into its own under the Tughlaqs. Due to the rapid expansion of the empire, large salaries and allowances were given to the nobles by Muhammad Tughlaq. We are told that his wazir enjoyed an income of as large as that of the province of Iraq. The other leading ministers got 20,000 to 40,000 tanaks a year. The chief Sadr getting 60,000 tanaks a year. Khani Jahan, the wazir of Firoz Tughlaq, used to get 15 lakhs. His sons and son-in-law, who were very numerous, got separate allowances. During the Tughlaq period, a number of nobles were able to bequeath large fortunes. Thus, Bashir, who was Firoz's Aris-e-Mamalik, left 13 crores at his death. On the ground that Bashir had been originally his slave, Firoz confiscated most of his wealth and distributed the rest among his sons. This may be regarded more or less as an exception. The property of a noble was generally safe and was allowed to pass on to his sons. It was this section which brought lands on which they built gardens, orchards, markets, etc. The Sultan and his nobles took keen interest in improving the quality of fruits in India, especially melons and grapes. In this way, new type of landed gentry began to develop. The breakup of the Delhi Sultanate towards the beginning of the 15th century halted this trend. Town life, slaves, artisans, and others. We have already referred to the revival of towns and town life under the Sultanate. The Turkish ruling class was essentially an urban ruling class with a taste for town life. Many of the towns grew around military garrisons as providers of food, goods, and services to them. In due course, many of them emerged as cultural centers. The medieval towns had a miscellaneous population, including many lesser nobles and a large class of clerks for running government offices, shopkeepers, artisans, beggars, etc. The post of clerks and lower government officials had obviously to be given to the people who could read and write. Since the work of teaching was largely in the hands of Muslim theologians, ulama, and the ulama and the lower officials tended to think and behave alike, most of the historians were drawn from this section, and the writings reflect the opinions and prejudices of this section. Beggars who generally wore arms like the ordinary citizens formed a large mass and could sometimes create a problem of law and order. Another large section in the town consisted of slaves and domestic servants. Slavery had existed in India as well as in the West Asia and Europe for a long time. The position of different types of slaves, one born in household, one purchased, one acquired, and one inherited, is discussed in the Hindu Shastras. Slavery has been adopted by the Arabs and later by the Turks also. The most usual method of acquiring a slave was capture in war. Even the Mahabharata considered it normal to enslave a prisoner of war. The Turks practiced this on a large scale in their wars in and outside India. Slave markets for men and women existed in West Asia as well as in India. The Turkish, Caucasian, Greek, and Indian slaves were valued and were sought after. A small number of slaves were also imported from Africa, mainly Abyssinia. Slaves were generally bought for domestic service, for company, or for their special skills. Skilled slaves or comely boys and handsome girls sometimes fetched a high price. Skilled slaves were valued and some of them rose to high offices, as in the case of slaves of Qutbuddin Aibak. Firoz Tughlaq also prized slaves and collected about 1,80,000 of them. Many of them were mere employed in handicrafts, while others formed the Sultan's personal bodyguard. The largest number of slaves were, however, used for personal service. Such slaves were sometimes treated harshly. It can be argued that the condition of slave was better than that of domestic servant because the master of the former was obliged to provide him food and shelter, while the free person may starve to death. Slaves were allowed to marry and to own some personal property. However, it was widely accepted that slavery was degrading. Given a slave his or her liberty was considered a meritorious act both among the Hindus and the Muslims. In general, foodstuffs were cheap for the townsfolk during the Sultanate period. We have mentioned the price of foodstuffs under Alauddin Khilji. In his reign, a man about 15 kg of wheat, a man about 15 kg of wheat was sold for 7.5 jittals, barley for 4 and rice for 5 jittals, with 50 jittals being equal to a silver tanak. Price rose sharply after Muhammad Tughlaq, but declined almost to Alauddin's levels under Firoz. It is possible that this may have been due to the extension of cultivation during his reign. It is difficult to compute the cost of living in the towns. A modern historian has estimated that during Firoz's reign, a family consisting of a man, his wife, a servant, and 1 or 2 children could live on 5 tanaks for a whole month. Thus, for a lower government official or a soldier, living was cheap. But this did not apply to the artisans and workers in the same way. Even under Akbar, an unskilled laborer earned 2.5 to 3 rupees a month or even less. In the terms of their income, the living conditions of artisans and workers in towns appear to have been hard. Thus, medieval society was a society of great inequalities. This was reflected in the Muslim society even more than the Hindu, the latter being predominantly rural, where inequalities were less marked. In towns, the Muslim nobility led a great life of great ostentation. Some of the wealthy merchants, Hindu and Muslim, also led lives of ostentation. The great mass of people in towns as well as in countryside lived a simple life and often had to face many hardships. It was, however, not a life without joy, as numerous festivals, fairs, etc. relieved to some extent the monotony of their lives. Thank you everyone for tuning in. In the next part, we'll start with the next paragraph on caste, social manners, and customs. Thank you for tuning in. All the best for exams, and do share and subscribe the channel for more videos like this. Thank you everyone.